For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with music. All kinds of music. It really didn't matter what kind. It could be jazz, or blues, or even classical for that matter. But if it was rock and roll, I really liked it. My fascination with music seemed to have had a natural segue to my intense interest with the guitar. I have no idea where it came from. It was like it was just there, so I went with it. When I was 8 years old, I got to hold a guitar in my hands for the very first time. Then, for Christmas, when I was 13, I got my first guitar. It wasn't a very good one, and it was really hard to play. By the time I was 15, a friend of mine began to teach me some of what he knew, and I learned my very first song. That same year, I got my first really good guitar, which I still have to this day. So now that I've given some personal history, let's fill in the spaces from a long, long time ago right up to today, so that we may examine how this instrument has evolved. Many believe the guitar evolved from an instrument called a lute. However, research done in the 1960s by Dr. Michael Kasha showed that the lute and the guitar were actually in separate lines of development. While the guitar and the lute had common ancestors, the lute actually had no influence on the guitar's development. According to the information that I have gathered, the history of the guitar actually can be traced back as far as 4,000 years. Archaeologists have identified the tambour as the earliest known stringed guitar-like instrument. It's speculated that the tambour probably evolved from an instrument called the bow harp. There is a kind of family resemblance, although with a straight neck, the tambour can create more notes than a bow harp ever could. For a little more historical perspective, if you'll focus on the lower left quadrant of this illustration of an Egyptian tomb painting, you'll notice a harp and a tambour, along with a flute and percussion instruments in an ensemble. This was dated some 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, making it perhaps the world's oldest band. This next graphic was referred to by my source information as the ultimate vintage guitar. It belonged to an Egyptian singer named Harmos, and it was thought to be 3,500 years old. Harmos was employed by Senmut, who was very prominent, and served as the architect to the pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut, crowned in 1503 BCE. Senmut designed and built the pharaoh's mortuary temple that still stands on the banks of the Nile. Finally, in what may be the ultimate expression of the love of an instrument, Harmos' tambour was found buried next to him in his tomb. Many similar relics have been found by archaeologists studying ancient Persian and Mesopotamian cultures. Surprisingly, many of the artifacts of these relics survive as instruments in these modern times, nearly unchanged. Folk instruments like the Turkish saz or the Iranian setar or the Greek bouzouki are prime examples of these findings. According to Dr. Kasha, who we met earlier, a guitar is defined as having a long, fretted neck, flat wooden soundboard, ribs, and a flat back, most often with curved sides. A stone carving found in an ancient Anatolian site in north-central Turkey called Alaka Hayuk is thought to be the oldest example of the essential features of guitar, a Hittite guitar at that. It's thought to be 3,300 years old. The information from which I worked explained that the term guitar actually came from ancient Sanskrit, believe it or not. The Sanskrit term for string is tar. Moreover, my information explained that Sanskrit provided the foundation for the languages of much of Central Asia and Northern India. I mention this to help explain not only why so many instruments were so similar, but also why they were named so logically. I mentioned earlier that tambour-like instruments from Turkey, Iran, and Greece had basically escaped evolution. They remain essentially true to the original. The same is true for some stringed instruments from these regions as well. An instrument called a dutar is a two-stringed instrument. This also evolved from the Sanskrit term spelled dvi, which translated to the modern Persian du plus tar literally means a two-stringed instrument. The instrument known as a cedar is a three-stringed instrument. Once again, this came from the Sanskrit term tri, translated to the modern Persian si, meaning literally three strings. This pattern continued through to instruments called katar and panktar. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any graphics on these last two instruments. The final instrument in this group is the Indian sitar, which took its name from the Persian cedar, but it definitely did not remain faithful to the original, as did the others. The four-string Persian kartar seemed to have had the predominant influence on what would become the guitar in Europe. Arriving in Spain during the Middle Ages, the kartar design underwent some modifications to the body and neck, but maintained the four-string layout, except instead of four single strings, the Spanish guitarra had four-string sets tuned in unison. Around 1350 CE, when the Renaissance began, the four-course guitar was the instrument of choice. However, the five-course guitarra battente appeared in Italy around the same time. The five-course guitar brought with it a tuning that we now call standard. Today's six-stringed guitars have the same standard tuning as the guitarra battente with an additional bass E string. In the 1600s, a sixth string was added to the guitarra battente. This then became a trend all over Europe. It is interesting to note that the addition of a sixth string apparently also led to the five-string sets to move to six single strings. The form of the modern guitar started to become a reality at the beginning of the 19th century. However, the bodies were still rather small. The small body guitars began to change in 1859 when the Spanish luthier Antonio Torres Jurado introduced his guitar design. It is considered to be the prototype of the modern classical guitar. Volume, tone, and projection were dramatically improved with the larger body. This was made possible by his development of the fan-top bracing pattern. This provided the necessary support for the new and much larger body. During this same period of time, a German immigrant to America began making guitars with what was called X-bracing. Christian Frederick Martin used the X-bracing to further reinforce a guitar's relatively thin top to help it withstand the pull of new and popular steel strings, as well as to support the increasing body sizes. The archtop guitar was a departure from the flat-top acoustic in classical guitars. The strings were anchored to the tail of the guitar rather than to the top. It also utilized an oval rather than a round sound hole. The design produced more volume by allowing the top to vibrate more freely. Orville Gibson began building such guitars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is believed the cello was the inspiration for this design. In the late 1920s, a designer named Lloyd Loar joined Gibson. He further refined Gibson's original design by incorporating F-holes, a floating bridge, and a tailpiece similar to a cello's. The electric guitar was actually born during the same period. Pickups were added to the Hawaiian-style guitar and the jazz guitar design of Gibson and Loar. However, the popularity of these electric models did not begin to take hold until 1936, when Gibson introduced the ES-150 model. The musician, Charlie Christian, made it famous and inspired other guitarists to take it up. As guitars evolved in both design and popularity, guitarists had a desire to make the guitar more of a featured instrument rather than simply one to accompany others. At first, the use of a microphone seemed to be a logical step in accomplishing this goal. However, builders also began to experiment with and install what were called tungsten pickups. The Rickenbacker frying pan guitar had such pickups installed. When amplifiers became more refined and more accessible, the need for sound holes and F-holes became less necessary. They never went away, but magnetic guitar pickups allowed for the development of a non-acoustic guitar, the solid body. In 1946, Leo Fender, seen here along with some of his early electric guitar designs, began to experiment with the concept of the solid body guitar. At about the same time, Les Paul began formulating plans for a solid body electric guitar. He came up with what came to be known as his log guitar. Can you tell how it got that name? The center block was literally a 4x4 block of wood attached to a guitar neck. In 1950, Fender introduced a prototype solid body guitar. They called it the Esquire. It featured a single pickup. In 1951, the guitar was reintroduced, but with two pickups. The model was renamed the Broadcaster. At some point, the same model went through another name change. The Telecaster, as it is now called, was the first mass-produced solid body guitar. The Telecaster was, and still is, a very popular guitar. Many artists, past and present, in rock, blues, and country, use this model. Artists such as Bruce Springsteen, James Burton, Keith Richards, Muddy Waters, Roy Buchanan, and Syd Barrett, a founding member of Pink Floyd, all used the Telecaster as their instrument of choice. For their part, Gibson introduced their first solid body guitar in 1952. Gibson gained the endorsement of Les Paul, a well-known musician and designer. Les Paul lent his name to this guitar. It is arguably one of the most popular guitars of any style. Many accomplished players use the Les Paul, such as Jimmy Page, Joe Perry, Pete Townsend, and Neil Young. In 1954, Fender introduced the Stratocaster, arguably the main competition to the Les Paul for the most popular electric solid body guitar. As with the Telecaster and the Les Paul, there are many loyal and accomplished artists who are partial to the Fender Stratocaster. A notable few are Buddy Holly, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimi Hendrix, Rory Gallagher, David Gilmour, and Stevie Ray Vaughan. I think that it would be safe to say that music, in one form or another, has existed in all cultures, past and present. That's certainly not a scientifically based statement, but I think it is safe to say nonetheless. Also, it seems like stringed instruments, like the guitar, have been around for quite some time as well. Given that, it is perhaps also safe to say that this instrument may be around for a while longer. At least I hope so.